Gentleman from Maryland yields back. We now recognize gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gooden.
I yield my time to Mr. McClintock.
Gentleman yields his time.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. First, I want to assure Mr. Liu that Messrs. Hilton and Ring and Greenhunt are three of the most insightful experts on California public policy that I've had the honor to work with during my 45 years of public service, and I can't imagine a more distinguished panel than we have before us right now. Mr. Liu might also be surprised to learn that before the modern era, California lost 4.5 million acres a year on average to catastrophic fire. Then in the 20th century, we established land management agencies to do a little of the gardening ourselves instead of leaving it to nature. We auctioned off excess timber to logging companies that paid us to remove the excess. We leased public lands to cattle and sheep ranchers to suppress brush growth through grazing. We did controlled burns to remove undergrowth. We cut fire breaks to contain fires. We used herbicides to keep brush from residential areas. We put out fires before they could explode out of control. And our fire losses declined from 4.5 million acres a year on average to just 250,000 acres a year throughout the 20th century. But we don't do those practices anymore. Our fire losses are now back up to an average of 1.5 million acres in 2020, 4.5 million acres. Mr. Greenhunt, what happened?
Thanks, Congressman. It just seems like an ideological shift. We've moved towards land preservation at all costs. And I was just looking through, thinking of
but it doesn't preserve the land, does it? It's caused the incineration of the land.
Exactly. I mean, the idea was to preserve species. I mean, we pointed out before that we. And some of it's growth control, too. Pointed out that a project was stopped for hardening the telephone poles over concerns about an endangered weed. It's this, yeah.
Mr. Ring,
yeah.
Is this a policy issue, or is this an act of God?
Everything's an act of God, but policy has a lot to do with what actually happens. California's forests, since the enforcement of environmental regulations became more aggressive, are now overgrown. I know you're very familiar with this. The average tree density, and this is verified by several studies from universities in California, Merced, Berkeley, Davis, elsewhere. The tree density in the Central Sierra is now about 5 times what's historically normal. The ladder fuels, which would ordinarily, that's the scrub and underbrush and young trees, which would normally burn in controlled burns or fires started by lightning strikes. When that doesn't happen anymore, you have trees that are allegedly dying because of climate change, but they're actually dying because you've got so many more trees competing with the same amount of light
you can
and nutrients.
You can actually tell the boundary between the private lands that are not subject to these laws and the public lands just by the condition of the forests on each side of that boundary line. How clever of the climate to know exactly where the boundary lines are and only decimate the federal lands. I can offer some good news, and that is in 2016, we got a categorical exclusion from NEPA for forest thinning projects in the Tahoe Basin Management Unit. That simple change has taken the environmental studies from 4.5 years down to just a few months. It's taken the environmental reports from 800 pages down to a few dozen. It's increased the timber yield on the Tahoe Basin from 1 million board feet a year to 9 million board feet a year. It's tripled the amount of treated acreage. That's what saved the town of South Lake Tahoe from the Caldor fire. Unfortunately, right across the boundary line was the town of Grizzly Flats that was not protected by this law. It was completely incinerated by the same fire. Now, we got those provisions finally this year, just a few weeks ago, into the Fix Our Forests Act. It passed the House with 141 Democrats opposing it. Mr. Hilton, I'll give you the final word. What would you say to those Democrats?
I think I'd first of all say to Mr. Liu, I think we'd take his righteous indignation a little bit more seriously if he wasn't in nearly every single case the first to jump on one of the terrible tragedies that we see too often in our country of mass shooting, to immediately call for the kinds of reforms that would stop it happening.
These fires have nothing to do with
And
mass shootings.
Exactly. And that's what we're here to do, to stop people dying, to stop people losing their homes, to stop the terrible human and economic cost of these fires. That's what we are here arguing for, those kinds of changes that could be made and would stop the severity and impact of these kinds of fires.
Gentlemen's time has expired. We'll now